Of the billions and billions of stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way, and the billions and billions of galaxies in the universe, the law of probability tells us that there are 10,000 solar systems exactly like ours. If any of those older ones, since we are the youngest star, survived their space age, they could have visited us. Yes, I believe in UFOs. American theoretical physicist Richard Feynman. Feynman was clearly one of the greats of physics. The path integral QM, the theory of quantum electrodynamics, the Feynman diagrams, etc., are all outstanding accomplishments. If he thinks UFOs are real, maybe it's time we took them seriously. What if the sole purpose of many megalithic structures in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas was to collect gold from running water? What does this have to do with UFOs and extraterrestrial life, you may be wondering? Join us as we journey into the past and uncover the secrets of a vanished civilization. Human beings all over the planet have been asking the same questions for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Are we alone in the universe? Are there other civilizations out there? Did they come to visit us? Are they trying to visit us? Is there a God? Today we attempt to answer some of those questions. The mysteries of alien technology. One of the lesser-known researchers in this field is a man by the name of Marshall Klarfeld. Klarfeld is an author and retired engineer. Since his retirement, he has researched the work of Zecharia Sitchin, whom he sees as his mentor. He agrees with Sitchin in many areas, but has branched off and come to some intriguing conclusions in others, such as the purpose of megalithic structures around the world, for instance. Sitchin and Klarfeld agree that an advanced space-age civilization called the Anunnaki was here on the planet Earth 400,000 years ago. They colonized our planet and were also very instrumental in producing the human race, Homo sapiens. After decades of research, Klarfeld says, "The evidence, the irrefutable physical evidence that I've discovered indicates that this advanced civilization was truly here, and it was remarkable. The things that they were able to create are truly astonishing." Using the Sumerian database, Klarfeld describes how he works with ancient sources. I look at the information that Zecharia revealed from translating the Sumerian tablets and cylinder seals and treat them like a database. By the way, hundreds of thousands of these artifacts remain undeciphered even to this day. The evidence that I have, and that Zecharia produced, was the database of what this species left here on planet Earth. The physical evidence, the pyramids, and many, many stone structures that are so magnificent in their accomplishment and in their architecture and their design that humans of that time could not have produced them. In some cases, we couldn't make them today, which to me is proof positive of an advanced civilization. I call them the Anunnaki, Homo erectus, and the sudden appearance of Homo sapiens. Klarfeld turns to anthropology and the fossil record. Homo sapiens are only about 200,000 years old. The first skeletal remains of a species called Homo sapiens were found in Southeast Africa. The species that preceded Homo sapiens was Homo erectus. Homo erectus had been evolving on planet Earth for over 800,000 years. He contrasts their abilities with ours. They walked upright and they developed tools, but the tools advanced only to spears and stones, and their brain capacity was a third of our size. From this, he draws a decisive conclusion. Now, if evolution produced our species, Homo sapiens, there would be skeletal remains showing stages between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, but there aren't any. In other words, this species that you and I are part of, Homo sapiens, appears out of nowhere 200,000 years ago. Klarfeld explains, Anunnaki genetic engineering. Klarfeld aligns this sudden appearance with Sumerian stories. The story in the cuneiform tablets coincides with that event in that they, the Anunnaki, this advanced space-age civilization, took and upgraded Homo erectus. He describes the process as he understands it. They created a hybrid species by taking the egg from the female Homo erectus and scooping out the nucleus. They put their DNA in there and planted it in one of the Anunnaki females, a birth mother. The product of that procedure, genetic engineering, was Adam. They called him Adamu, and there are cylinder seals that show this process. He adds a key detail. And from the beginning, the story goes, they also created a female called Eve. Sterility, hybrids, and the story of Adam's rib. Klarfeld then discusses a problem with the first created humans. But the problem with these procedures was that they were sterile. In other words, if you take a horse and a donkey and mate them, you'll get a mule, and mules are sterile. They can't reproduce themselves. So that's a similar situation that we had here. He links this to the familiar biblical narrative. And so we have the story of Adam's rib in the Bible, which was a kind of retelling of what the original story was in the cuneiform tablets, that they, in order to make Eve fertile, had to do a four-way operation in which they took marrow from Adam's rib and somehow manipulated Eve to create a fertile female, so that the humans could then reproduce themselves and the Anunnaki birth mothers were given a rest. For Klarfeld, this is the true launch point of our lineage. So that's the story of our beginnings. That's really how our species was launched 200,000 years ago. A second intervention. Homo sapiens sapiens. Klarfeld distinguishes between two stages of human design. There was another intervention later on, after the flood. That created an improved species called Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's what you and I are. We are not Homo sapiens, we're Homo sapiens sapiens, which is thinking man. We are much more intelligent than the first models, the Homo sapiens Adam and Eve. He explains how this second upgrade occurred. This, according to the cuneiform records, was accomplished by a direct mating of an Anunnaki male with a human female. Why the Anunnaki came? Gold and a leaking atmosphere. Klarfeld then explains the Anunnaki's motive for coming to Earth. According to the cuneiform tablets, they came to Earth in pursuit of gold. They needed gold to heal the atmosphere of their planet, which orbits the Sun at a distance far beyond Pluto, following an elliptical path. They had essentially developed an ozone leak, and they needed to seal it up to save themselves. He sums up the purpose of their mission. So the object of their adventure here on planet Earth was to take the gold and send it back home and enclose the ozone leak. Klarfeld on evolution's limits. Klarfeld insists that natural evolution alone cannot explain our rapid advance. All species on Earth, according to most researchers, develop very slowly. In other words, evolution is an extremely slow process. He returns to Homo erectus as the baseline. For instance, if you look at Homo erectus, for 800,000 years they evolved, perhaps from another branch of the primate tree. But their evolution apparently came to a halt. The furthest they got was walking upright and using wooden spears and stone tools. By the way, they had no vocal cords. They couldn't speak. They grunted. He contrasts that with the sudden abilities of Homo sapiens. When the next species arrives, Homo sapiens, we have an intelligent, upright species that is able to talk and able to take commands. Ideal for a primitive worker, which was the goal that the Anunnaki had in creating Homo sapiens. Nephilim, those who from heaven to earth came. Klarfeld turns to the Bible and his earlier religious background. I was a student of the Bible before I got into this, so I'm quite familiar with what it says in the Hebrew Bible. If you look at Genesis 6:4, it says the Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and they coveted the daughters of man, and had intercourse with them, and created the giants of old. He recalls Sitchin's central question. The question that Zechariah asked himself originally was, who were the Nephilim, and why doesn't the Bible go on to explain that they were the sons of God? That kind of raised a lot of questions that biblical scholars avoid or don't deal with directly. Klarfeld states the interpretation he shares with Sitchin. I think the reference in Genesis 6:4 to the Nephilim, those who from heaven to earth came, does indeed point to the Anunnaki, giants of old, Atlas, Hercules, Goliath. Klarfeld identifies the giants in myth as literal hybrids. He explains why they would be so large. They were giants because the main Anunnaki species, according to the cuneiform tablets and the cylinder seals, were giants. They were 9 feet tall as a species, so if you bred a 9-foot-tall Anunnaki with a human, which in those days were only about 5 feet tall, you get something in between. Familiar stories fit this pattern for him. And we have the story of David slaying Goliath. The Greeks had many references to the heroes of their civilization, who were also very large beings. The giants of old, like Atlas, Hercules and Goliath, were the offspring of the Anunnaki demigods. Near extinction 11,500 years ago. Klarfeld then makes a key claim about our near erasure. Here's what most people can't grasp. First, that the species Homo sapiens sapiens came close to extinction 11,500 years ago when the Great Flood occurred. He stresses the scale of destruction. The population that had evolved on the planet was totally decimated by this event and started over again. Many other species that were around couldn't survive and were wiped out. There was no food. There were no animals to use for food, and you couldn't grow plants because it was just an impossible situation. The earth was covered with 10 miles of mud, and anything that lived on the surface needed help to survive. This leads him to a practical genealogical point. So I think we should probably trace our genealogy from about 11,000 years ago after the flood. Klarfeld continues, the Epic of Gilgamesh and post-flood aid. Klarfeld turns to a Mesopotamian epic for what happened after the flood. The 11th tablet of the Epic Gilgamesh goes into great detail as to what the Anunnaki did after the flood to help the survivors reproduce and continue to survive on the planet. He lists what the text says they brought. They brought down trees, they brought down animals, and they brought down domesticated wheat. There's evidence of that, 9,000-year-old domesticated wheat found on Mount Ararat. For him, small clues support a bigger picture. So there are scant traces of evidence here and there that indicate, apparently with the aid of an outside advanced civilization, some humans survived the flood 11,500 years ago and started over again, and here we are now. Stone Age tribes and technology transfer. Klarfeld notes that some human groups remained untouched. There were many catastrophes that happened prior to the flood, but let's just talk about the species that remained after the flood. There are still some aboriginal species that live in remote places, like in New Guinea and in South America and other parts of the world, where they've been untouched by outside interference, and they're living in the Stone Age. He emphasizes that not everyone chose civilization. There are tribes that just didn't have any reason to become civilized, they just stayed at the Stone Age level. Klarfeld then draws his core conclusion. So you have to believe, as I do, that there's been a technology transfer going on throughout the course of human events which has aided our species to advance to where we are now today. We didn't do it on our own. It didn't happen naturally like evolution would. He points to the time-scale contrast again. There were injections of advanced technology and perhaps DNA manipulation, which brought us up to the level we are today. If you look at the scheme of things, it took Homo erectus 800,000 years to get to the advanced tool-making of stones and spears. Yet, we're only 200,000 years old as a species, and we're walking on the moon in 1969. Now that does not happen in evolution. That could not happen. It's too quick. It's too much of an advance, and so you have to factor in this outside manipulation and interference by an advanced species. Klarfeld explains, we don't have to wait for Nibiru. He next tackles a common assumption about Anunnaki return. Most people are under the misimpression that we have to wait until Nibiru returns before the Anunnaki can come back and interfere with us again, but that's not true. Klarfeld sees a different picture in the texts. If you read the texts, as I have and Zechariah did, they seem to have phased off the planet after they thought we were sufficiently advanced to take care of ourselves and take care of the planet, and they did so. He introduces the idea of a departing mothership. There was a mothership orbiting Earth when they colonized us, and that was the source of their technology and their resources. And when they took off, they took the mothership with them. And it could be hanging out as close by as, say, Mercury. If that's true, the return of this species to interfere again with the Earthlings is not impossible in a very short period of time. Enki versus Enlil. Two rival factions. Klarfeld then outlines the internal politics. I believe that there were two factions of the Anunnaki. One was headed up by the firstborn son of their king, his name was Enki, and the other faction was headed up by Enlil, who was the second-born son of Anu and the direct heir to the throne. They entered into a kind of conflict over a period of time. He highlights Enki's attitude toward humanity. The story of the events after the flood shows definitively that Enki was the force that saved humans from devastation. They, Anunnaki, weren't seen as gods at that time. They were seen as lords or overlords because they were more powerful. On the brink today. Klarfeld connects the ancient story to our own time. I think, and I'm a positive kind of a person, that right now we're on kind of the tipping point of our civilization. We have the ability to totally obliterate ourselves as a civilization. If things get out of hand, that could happen. He speculates on a possible new intervention. But I think if there is going to be another return of the Anunnaki, another intervention, and it's specifically Enki, that would save us from ourselves. My reasoning is this. In effect, I look at it as we are their experiment, their progeny. Now, if they want to keep us going and keep Earth going, it's in their best interest to prevent us from destroying each other. Who created the Anunnaki? Klarfeld acknowledges a bigger mystery behind his entire framework. We don't know who created the Anunnaki. We don't know where they came from. They apparently are maybe 1 million years more advanced than we are, and I'm sure there are other extraterrestrial life forms out there in the universe far more advanced than us. Klarfeld insists the Anunnaki themselves had a higher vision of origin. I think people should know that this advanced species wasn't totally without faith, or I don't know if I'd call it a religion, but they had a deity that they called the creator of all. And obviously they faced up to the same question that we face. Where did we come from? How did the universe come to be? But as for who this creator is, I'm afraid these are questions that are almost impossible to answer. Before humans, cities of the Anunnaki. Turning to the pre-human era, Klarfeld reflects on the earliest traces of their presence. Their appearance here on planet Earth apparently started with the sole purpose of seeking gold. There were no humans 400,000 years ago, so for 200,000 years they were colonizing the Earth with their people. During this period, they built their cities. He points to archaeology in Mesopotamia. Their pre-diluvial cities existed in a place called Mesopotamia, and there's still evidence of their existence. We've dug up the remains of those cities. They prove that a civilization was flourishing for hundreds of thousands of years before we appeared. Then he marks the point where humans enter the picture. Then we appeared 200,000 years ago by their interference or intervention, if you want to call it that, and so the new species which emerged slowly but gradually was given more technical information which was transferred to us. As we can see in our history, when an advanced civilization encounters a primitive one, it always transfers its technology. That repeats itself over and over again in history. So I assume that's what happened to us when they did that. And finally, when they phased off the planet, they felt that we were capable of taking care of ourselves. Are we doing a good job? Klarfeld is blunt in his assessment of our stewardship. I don't think we're doing a very good job. I think we haven't really taken care of our home planet. We have certainly developed a nasty habit of killing each other, and that's really not a good way to advance as a civilization. Still, he sees hope in learning the true story. I think there are some positive things in the story that I'm talking about. The fact is that if we learn from history, we will maybe prevent the mistakes of the past, and our future will be secure. They appear out of nowhere. The Sumerian explosion. Klarfeld returns to the Sumerians and their astonishing suddenness. What's amazing about the Sumerians is that they appear out of nowhere, like 6,000 years ago. This civilization arrives with all of the firsts. He lists the hallmarks of that culture. In other words, they came out of the caves with a language that is written. They've got poetry, they've got mathematics, physics, chemistry, astrology, astronomy, music, schools, and religion. That just doesn't happen in history. You just don't have a civilization blossom like the Sumerians did, with streets that were regularly laid out in a format just like you would have a city in New York. Klarfeld relays what the Sumerians themselves claimed. You've got to ask yourself, how did that happen? How did the Sumerians do what they did? They wrote in the cuneiform tablets, "Everything we had was given to us by the Anunnaki." So to me, that's a statement of technology transfer, of jump-starting civilization. Anu, Enlil, Enki, the numbered pantheon. Next, Klarfeld outlines the numerical hierarchy of the Anunnaki leaders. There were 12 leaders in the pantheon. The top guy was Anu, and his number was 60. He was the king back on the home planet, Nibiru. Enlil was 50, and Enki was 40. This is kind of an interesting way of giving power to people. Klarfeld explains how their succession rules seeded rivalry. There was a conflict between the firstborn son, Enki, who came here first, and the second-born son, Enlil. Enlil was born from the union of Anu and his spouse, his wife. Enki was born from Anu and a concubine. She was a royal person with good blood, but she was not a pure direct line. The result of these unions, he says, was a built-in succession crisis. So all of a sudden, we've set up here a scenario where the firstborn son, who should normally be the successor to the throne, is not, because of their rules on pure bloodlines. The second-born pure-blood Enlil is the direct heir to the throne. They're both very, very powerful beings in their own right. They had organizational abilities and engineering talents that were unparalleled. However, what started out as a joint venture soon became a challenge. Indeed, this scenario produced lots of conflict, lots of confrontations, and ended up 4,000 years ago in the first atomic war on the planet Earth. Atomic war and Sodom and Gomorrah. Klarfeld makes one of his most dramatic claims. It wasn't Enlil and Enki directly, but it was their sons who used 7 atomic weapons that had been secretly hidden here on the planet Earth. In the Bible, you have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the 2 cities that God destroyed. He links the biblical text to 20th century nuclear history. If you read in detail about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, you'll see the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You'll see exactly the same portrayal. It was atomic warfare which wiped out those 2 cities. But not just that. Some strategic spaceport sites were also obliterated, and this was all part of this rivalry between the Enlil clan and the Enki clan. From Sumer to Rome, the same gods, different names. Klarfeld sees continuity from Sumerian deities to classical pantheons. Now, what is fascinating to me is that this pantheon, these 12 leaders, traced their history for 6,000 years to every civilization after the Sumerians. You get to the Egyptians, you get to the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Hebrews, all the way down to the Greeks and the Romans. He focuses on the Roman parallels. In the Romans, you have a leader worshipped by the Romans. His name is Jupiter, and he's the commander, and his brother is Neptune. Neptune is the water god, and back in the beginning, Enlil was the commander, and Enki was the water god. Then he connects this with Greek mythology. Then you go to the Greeks, and you get Zeus, who's the commander, and his brother Poseidon. He's the water god. They have the same characters, the same physical attributes, the same qualities, and the same leadership and powers. These are traced back 6,000 years to the Sumerian civilization and all the way up to the Romans. They may have different names, but they are essentially variations of Enki and Enlil. No human sacrifice in Anunnaki culture. Klarfeld draws a sharp line between Anunnaki practice and later human religion. In the stories that we have from the database of the cuneiform tablets and the seals, there was no human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was not at all a part of the Anunnaki culture. He describes their code of punishment. As a matter of fact, they had kind of a credo that they didn't kill each other. If you got really in trouble, if you did bad things, or were found to be guilty of bad things, you were exiled or sent away, but never killed. That was the punishment. Later on, of course, the younger generation of Anunnaki became more belligerent, and they did have wars, and they did kill each other. According to him, human sacrifice emerged later from human misunderstanding. Human sacrifice, I think, developed from Homo sapiens' idea of how to connect with the gods. In other words, they knew about advanced species and knew about the Anunnaki. They eventually had them morph from lords into demigods and then into gods. And because they needed help from them, they would do things like human sacrifice to try to please what they thought was what the gods wanted. The religions that they introduced into human civilization were all control mechanisms. If you have a small, strong body of powerful people who have to control masses, you need some mechanisms. The first mechanism that they introduced was kingship, and the second one was religion. And these were definitely control mechanisms, but there was no sacrifice of human beings as a part of that endeavor. Thousands of years of control, kingship, and religion. Klarfeld reflects on the immense timescales involved. I think that we're talking about thousands of years of civilization, and you're talking about a species that came from a kind of a jump-start situation, then a kind of a slave environment in which they were used as primitive workers, and then given a little bit of freedom and some technology transfer and some rules like kingship and then religion. This took thousands of years, and it's hard for us to understand. He contrasts human time horizons with Anunnaki time frames. I mean, we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years. We can understand what goes on in that time frame. 100 years is difficult to understand. But you talk about thousands of years, all kinds of things could happen. The record, he says, is incomplete but telling. The record, frankly, is not that complete in that the translations don't cover everything. They give you kind of a glimpse into what life was like when they were coexisting, when the Anunnaki were in charge and the humans were subservient to them. And they did eventually develop worship of them. They worshipped Enlil first, and then they found other images to worship. And if you were a citizen in Rome, you had multiple gods, 12, 15, 20 gods that you would pay homage to, but they all were characterizations from the original Anunnakis, from ziggurats to pyramids. Klarfeld next compares Sumerian and Egyptian sacred architecture. The Sumerians built things called ziggurats. They resembled pyramids, but were constructed from mud bricks instead of stone blocks. They were very tall, like multi-story, up to 40 feet high, and they had stairways. Archaeologists have uncovered some of these and reconstructed them. He then moves to Egypt's later achievements. Egyptian civilization occurred about 300 years after the beginning of the Sumerian civilization. During the course of their magnificent history, they built pyramids. Now the pyramids are huge stone structures put together with precision-cut stones placed one atop another without any mortar. Impossible stonework? For Klarfeld, the construction techniques suggest advanced technology. This is kind of an interesting building technique. Most modern-day constructions are held together with steel rebars or concrete or blocks of mortar. The buildings that the Egyptians constructed were made of stone, and these stones were not easy to cut. These were made out of heavy, almost granite-like textures, and granite is very difficult to manipulate. He contrasts this with the tools mainstream archaeology attributes to the Egyptians. It takes special tooling, yet we know the Egyptians only had bronze and copper tools. There was no way you're going to cut a granite stone with bronze and copper tools, so you had to say somebody else did this, in conjunction maybe with Egyptian populations. Advanced construction everywhere. Klarfeld insists the evidence of superior technology is global. You know, there's evidence all over the place of advanced construction techniques and technology in these buildings. In the pyramids alone, the inside of the Great Pyramid is one of the most magnificent constructions that you could imagine. Early gold extraction, the Persian Gulf and Africa. Klarfeld then returns to the Anunnaki's primary goal, gold extraction. Originally, they tried to siphon gold from the basin in the Persian Gulf. He explains how natural processes brought gold into the Gulf. In the river water, nature has a way of stripping gold by water running over it and picking it up and taking it down the rivers, so they thought that they could mine the bottom of the Persian Gulf and get their gold there. But they got a whole bunch of other stuff when they were vacuuming up the silt from the bottom of the Persian Gulf. So they moved to more conventional mining. So they needed a more direct way to get it, and they did a survey. Enki went south and discovered gold veins in Southeast Africa, so they began traditional underground mining of gold there. They dug tunnels down to, I think as deep as it is today, 2 miles below the surface of the earth to extract gold. Then it was mixed up with rocks, and you had to break up the rocks and had to smelt it, just like we do today, the same kind of thing. New theories, gold mining and alien technology. Klarfeld outlines the progression of his own works. In my third book, The Anunnaki Were Here, I reveal a new theory that I came up with. It's called washboard gold mining. It's a theory that I have of step pyramids being used to separate placer gold from river water that contained gold particles, and he explains how his latest book extends that idea. And in my fourth book, Mysteries of Alien Technology, I go on to explain how they collected the gold from these washboard monuments, from the great pyramids like Chichen Itza and Teotihuacan, etc. These structures were actually gold mining facilities. According to Klarfeld, the flood forced a radical shift in mining methods. What happened at the flood was that these mines were inundated with mud. They were absolutely all buried, so they had to find another way, and it was kind of tedious to do it that way. The solution was to use nature's own gold transport again. So they discovered that they could separate the gold from the flow of water. There's placer water all over the planet that is stripping gold from the veins and bringing it downstream. And by the way, gold is 19 times heavier than water, so if you recall the old gold mining days in California, they had sluice boxes. The sluice box is where you take the sludge from the riverbeds where the gold was coming down, and you have a washboard in the sluice. The slurry goes down, hits the washboard, and the banging activity of the washboard knocks the gold down into the slots. Then you can just wash away the mud and the water, and you have gold captured in this washboard sluice box. Washboard monuments, pyramids as gold devices. Klarfeld believes the same principle was applied on a monumental scale, and that means of separating, I've speculated and written about and shown proof of, I think was done by the Anunnaki on a grand scale way beyond anything anybody before has imagined. For instance, let's take Chichen Itza. He describes the key features. It's a little house on the top of the step pyramid, and next to it is a cenote, which was an underwater river. In Mexico, there are a lot of underwater rivers that carry alluvium filled with gold and placer water, and it goes underground. Klarfeld then explains his interpretation of the system. I have evidence of a huge port down in that waterhole where they sucked up the placer water and pumped it up to the top of the Chichen Itza pyramid and let it flow over the edges. The steps of the step pyramid were essentially the collection surfaces. However, I still wondered how they collected the gold after they had separated it on these surfaces. Jason and the Golden Fleece, a clue from myth. Klarfeld says a Greek myth helped him solve the collection problem. Now, in the fourth book, Mysteries of the Anunnaki, I discovered the ancient Greek myth Jason and the Golden Fleece, and I did research on the Golden Fleece. He connects the myth to a known gold region. There's a place, Sochi, where they had the Winter Olympics, which is a gold-filled region in the Caucasus of Russia on the Black Sea, where gold just streams out into the water, and they collected it by using sheepskin. They take a sheepskin, it's mounted on a board, and they hold it in the river streams. The fibers of the sheepskin have lanolin-like qualities, and the gold particles would adhere to the fibers of the sheepskin. Eventually, you'd have a golden fleece, which was the story of Jason, the Argonauts, and the Golden Fleece. Sheepskins on the pyramids. He notes that the technique persisted into Roman and Greek times. So I know from my research that many of the Romans and the Greeks were sieving gold using sheepskins, and I've now come to the realization that was the same technique used by the Anunnaki to cover the surfaces of their washboard monuments, the step pyramids, the hundreds and thousands of step pyramids in Central and South America, and the Greek amphitheatre on Sicily and many others. Klarfeld expands the concept even further. Even the Great Wall of China was used as a placer washboard gold mining device, and it just all fits together. There's now a big furore going on in Southeast Africa about these stone circles. There are corral-like structures that Michael Tellinger talks about a lot. I've analysed and found similar circular stone structures in Syria and Peru, as there are in Africa. And these were, in effect, sheepfolds. They raised sheep in these enclosures, separating them out as we do today. And these sheepfolds produced the millions of pelts that were necessary to collect the gold from the Anunnaki Washboard gold mining facilities around the world. In his view, this ties several mysteries together. It solves, I think, many of the questions that are being raised today about what these stone circles were all about. I've come to the realization that they were places where they had to raise these millions of sheep because they needed lots of pelts. Orion, pyramids, and a hydraulic pulse pump. Klarfeld then turns to cosmic alignments and the internal mechanics of the Great Pyramid. I think there's a direct correlation with the Orion belt and the Orion constellation. The three central stars are the mirror image of the placement of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, as well as the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl in Teotihuacan. This is a repetition of, or perhaps an indication of, the origin of where their planet came from. He claims the pyramid's interior was built to carry water. But also, I have analysed the interior of the Great Pyramid. All the passages and the chambers are watertight, and there was no reason to build watertight passages inside of a pyramid unless you're going to put water in them. Klarfeld describes how he sees the structure functioning. I showed by graphic illustration in my books how this was a gigantic hydraulic pulse pump. Water flowed down the entrance into the pit, and before we had electricity, there was a device called a hydraulic pulse pump, which pumped water up without any external power source. This is what they used to drive the water up into the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery, if you look at it, is an upside-down step pyramid. The walls are corbelled as you go up in the Grand Gallery, and the water surged up into the Grand Gallery and into the King's Chamber. It was knocking the gold down into the 27 slots on the Grand Gallery floor, which probably had sheepskins in them, and they collected gold that way. The sarcophagus, that floated. Klarfeld offers a physical clue to support his hydraulic theory. Part of the evidence that I bring forward is that there's a sarcophagus in the King's Chamber. I've often been fascinated by that box because it's sitting there. Of course, no remains were ever found in it. It wasn't a burial chamber, but it was some kind of device. He points to the damage on the box, and I show by pictures how the outside edges of this box are totally destroyed by some kind of hammering action. Every edge is not pointed like it should be, it's smashed in. From Archimedes, he draws an inference. And according to Archimedes' principle, anything that's hollow will float, so my assumption is that when the water got to the King's Chamber, it floated the sarcophagus, and it banged against the walls inside of the King's Chamber until it was chipped and damaged, and water finally came into it, and it sank, and it landed where it is now in the King's Chamber. A challenge to the scientific community. Klarfeld says he's ready for skeptical scrutiny. I have some really strong physical evidence to support my theories, and I would ask any of those who are interested to explore these and prove that I'm wrong. I've challenged the scientific community in a documentary film that I'm about to produce, where I articulate this washboard gold mining theory by the Anunnaki, and I show examples. A couple of years ago, I actually went to the Greek amphitheatre in Sicily and proved that that structure was originally a washboard gold mining structure before it became an amphitheatre. What did they do with all that gold? Klarfeld then raises a crucial question. Once the ozone leak was fixed, why keep mining? I talked at length with Zechariah Sitchin about what they did with all the extra gold they were getting, because all those years of mining our gold were more than enough to close the ozone leak on their home planet, so there had to be some other use for it. He brings in new research on monatomic gold. We know that you can convert gold into monatomic particles, white powder gold. Recently, I think it was Graham Hancock or one of those folks over there found a monatomic processing plant on Mount Horeb. Folks who ingest this material claim it prolongs your life. The one thing that is most difficult for us to understand is how people could live, or how physical beings, flesh and blood beings, could live for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. However, we might now have found the answer. And it may have been that they, because of the adverse effects of our temperature cycle and our gravitational cycle compared to their home planet, were aging much more rapidly than they normally would have been at home, so they were looking for means to slow down their aging process, and they may have used the extra gold as a monatomic ingestion process. I don't know, I'm speculating on that, but it's possible, sure. Cone-shaped skulls and strange helmets. Turning to Anunnaki physiology, Klarfeld addresses elongated skulls. I think there is some validity to the fact that their species may have had cone-shaped craniums. There are folks out there in my field who are uncovering these skulls all over the place, and some of them they claim are natural, some of them were deformed by their mothers. He speculates about future human evolution. But if you look at the evolution of our species, it's highly possible that we will eventually, as we use more than 10% of our brain matter, need a larger shell to contain it as it grows and becomes more powerful. Klarfeld points to Egyptian imagery. And we have pictures in Egypt of Akhenaten, who was kind of an interesting pharaoh, and he started a whole new religion, but all the depictions of him are with a pointy skull, and his queen had a pointy skull. He also notes how Sumerian art hides Anunnaki heads under helmets. The artifacts from the Sumerian civilization show them wearing helmets. They always had their heads covered with these horned helmets, where the number of horns was kind of a rank. If you had 2 horns, you were a 20. If you had 4 horns, you were a 40. And 1 horn, you were a 15. But they covered up their heads in these magnificent helmets. They kind of had space-age connotations to them. A statue of Ishtar, this female Anunnaki, was discovered in 1930 in a place in Syria. In this life-size statue, she's wearing this helmet, which they call a sharu, which translates into goes far into the universe. It had horns on it, and it was adorned with various implements that gave it a look of protection, as if she were covering her head. Like our spacesuits, which have kind of round bowling ball helmets on them, their helmets had a conical shape, so maybe it accommodated a skull that was not natural like ours. Or perhaps theirs was natural and ours was unnatural. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed. When asked how they looked overall, Klarfeld gives a clear picture. I found that they were tall, blonde and blue-eyed. They were kind of Aryan in their features, and that is very consistent. He then offers his theory on how Earth's racial diversity arose. I have a theory of how the races occurred here on planet Earth. During the 800,000 years of evolution of Homo erectus, they managed to cover the land surface and some water areas all over the planet, allowing them to morph into many regions with different diets and climates. As a result, the Homo erectus species adapted to these various environmental and food chain differences. And so the 5 races that we have evolved, through evolution, from Homo erectus into the various parts of the world where we find them today. Klarfeld suggests that later hybridization preserved those traits, and then, when the interaction between the Anunnaki and these human females took place, They produced offspring that had the characteristics of the part of the world that they came from. And then, when they became Homo sapiens, they carried forward those characteristics so that we have different-looking Homo sapiens today that didn't come from the Anunnaki directly, but came from the stock that was used to create them. We look like them. Klarfeld gives a simple answer to the question of what the Anunnaki looked like. Many people ask me, what do the Anunnaki look like? And I say, well, if you look at the cylinder seals, they look like tall physical specimens, and they have large noses, and they have beards. Some of them don't, and they're very muscular and very strong. His conclusion is direct. And we look like them, they don't look like us. We look like them, and it's the story that they told about how we came into being that makes sense. We are their offspring, so why shouldn't we look like them? We are in their image too, as it says in the Bible. Artificial moons and spacecraft. Klarfeld considers the possibility of mega-engineering. It is possible. There's nothing beyond my imagination that isn't possible. They were so talented and so far advanced that we still don't know what their tools were or how they built some of the things I refer to in my books. But as far as artificial moons, sure, that's something they simply could build. They built the motherships. He reminds readers of the scale of their voyages. They came to Earth from a distant planet, from their own planet Nibiru. In order to get here, they had to do the things that we're trying to do, which is travel through space and time and go to distant places that are incredibly far away and overcome the voyage. But in order to do that, you had to have ships, chariots of the sky and ancient high-tech carvings. Klarfeld sees ancient descriptions of flight as literal memories, and there are many references in the Bible and also in all of the Sumerian tablets of the chariots of the skies, the golden chariots, the flying carpets. And there are even pictures on temple beams at Karnak and Abydos temples that show helicopters, submarines, and shuttlecraft designs. He asks what inspired those stone carvings. And you wonder, who's the guy sitting up there 2,000, 3,000 years ago chiseling? What's he looking at to produce these objects? Or the other side of that coin, maybe they were just playing with us and giving us a little peek into the future by illustrating their technology on these simple beams as kind of, here's what we did, this is what we can do, someday you'll do that too. Nazca lines, messages to future aviators. Klarfeld sees a similar intention in Peru's massive geoglyphs. If you look at things like the Nazca lines, which are huge biomorphs on the plain in Peru, a 14,000-foot high plain, that are drawn so that you can only see them from the air. We didn't see them until the 1920s when our aeroplanes started to fly over them. He imagines the mindset of their creators. These guys are kind of clever. They knew that one day we would learn how to fly, so they left some messages for us on this plane. A mothership watching the flood. Klarfeld admits there's no direct text about the mothership, but there are clues. According to the Sumerian tablets, during the Great Flood, the Anunnaki left the surface of the earth and looked down and saw the devastation. There were conversations about their emotions, how they felt about what was going on down below. The point is, they were looking down from a great height. So, to me, they were in a ship somewhere orbiting the Earth, watching the devastation. So that's the evidence. How the flood happened, Nibiru and the Antarctic ice shelf. Klarfeld summarizes the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh as a scientific forecast. According to the 11th tablet of the 12-tablet epic Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki were scientifically very knowledgeable, and they knew that every time their planet came into the inner orbit of Earth, it caused gravitational effects on the planet Earth. He explains the specific mechanism. And at that time, They said that the Antarctic ice shelf had softened and was going to be drawn into the southern oceans by the force of Nibiru as it came through. It was going to cause a gigantic tsunami, a 1,000-foot-high tsunami, which they knew was coming. Klarfeld is fascinated by how different factions responded. And it's interesting how the two warring factions, the Enkiites and the Enlilites, dealt with the destruction of humankind. Enlil really wanted to get rid of us. He said, "They're too noisy, we're diluting their bloodline, and we should get rid of all the humans and start over again." And Enki, interestingly, in this story, which you've got to read to understand exactly how it happened, found a way to save us. That's the story of Noah in the Bible, but the point is, they knew it was coming and they knew what was going to happen. Noah's Ark as a submersible. Klarfeld offers a very different image of the Ark. The Ark was a submersible. They drew it as a submarine with a snorkel on it, and that's the only way you could survive a tsunami. If it just rained and the water went straight up, you could have an ark floating on top of it, but that isn't what was going to happen. They knew it was going to be a tidal wave tsunami, and in order to survive, you had to have a submersible that could survive in wave conditions. So their picture of it, and I reproduce it in the book, was a sub. Thoth, Ningishzida and Quetzalcoatl. One life, 3 names. Klarfeld then turns to one of the most important Anunnaki figures in his narrative. Thoth was the son of Enki. Ningishzida was his first name. He's the designer of the pyramids. There's a direct translation in my new book, The Mysteries of Alien Technology, where I describe, or I reproduce, the translation that Zechariah made, why the pyramids were built where they were built, and who designed them. And this was the son of Enki, Ningishzida. His face was put on the Sphinx as a commemoration for the work he did. He follows the same being across continents. Later on, he became Thoth in Egypt. He was a ruler for 1,500 years until his brother Marduk exiled him from Egypt. He then went to the New World, became Quetzalcoatl, and created the civilizations of the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and all those folks over there. So Thoth was a very influential Anunnaki, son of Enki. Klarfeld notes modern channeling claims, but remains cautious. There are folks who are channeling that say this same personality, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl, who was originally Ningishzida, is now the head of the Anunnaki on Nibiru, a multi-talented engineer of civilizations. Klarfeld clearly admires Ningishzida, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl. You know, if you designed the pyramids and the complexity of the interior of the Great Pyramid, and if he was able to create the beauty and magnificence for 1,500 years of his rule in Egypt, of the Egyptian civilization, and then he went on to the New World and became the leader of the mining operations there, his career was magnificent. He lists the gifts attributed to him. The Egyptians credit him with time, the calendar, mathematics, and many, many things. He was a multi-talented son of one of the most brilliant Anunnaki, who was Enki, the firstborn. And this history predates the Bible by thousands and thousands of years. It's very important that people understand that this is really what happened to us, and once they understand that, maybe there's hope that we can learn to live together in peace.